Great.
Thank you very much. That's actually a really good example of, a government service in our everyday life. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited to be here and happy that you found some time to join me. I'm going to throw some slides up as soon as I can. There we go. I'm excited to have a conversation today about different partnership and collaboration models that can make a difference in the public sector. So hopefully right now you're seeing just my cover slide around partnership models. Excellent. So at a very high level, I thought we would spend our time first defining a little bit what these partnerships are and some of the more formal ones, some of the informal ones, talk about what drives them, and then dive into some examples. A lot of my examples are anonymized a little bit because a lot of it is based on my time working as a consultant, though some of it is from my Chicago experience. But I'm guessing that all of you actually have experience as well. And so hopefully as we get into the questions down the road, we'll be able to actually share some of those lessons learned across the group here today, which would be fantastic. So why don't we dive in? And Hannah, thank you for monitoring questions. I won't stop unless you tell me to. So in my experience, there are both formal and informal partnership models that show up in the public sector that can have an impact in the public sector. Those informal ones are, don't necessarily have a specific name. Now I just lost my slides. Hold on, I'm sorry. Is it still sharing?
Yep, I can still see it.
Okay, how come you can see it and I can't? Let's see. There we go. No. Is the view? Yep. Thank you, Benjamin. I appreciate that. I'm going to unshare and share back really quickly, guys, because I somehow have lost it. I don't know how. All righty. All right. So I think I'm back to where I started again. So those informal partnerships can be kind of any arrangement between organizations that focus on improving the service delivery to constituents, driving better policy outcomes. They may or may not be formally documented. You'll see that in some of the examples, and they may or may not require legislative action to be put in place. I think the counter to this is the very formal sort of model around public-private partnerships, the 3Ps or a PPP, which has become a sort of formally defined thing in the world of public sector service delivery. This is a cooperative agreement between one or more public sector entities, generally the government, and a private sector company or more than one of them. This collaboration typically aims to both finance, construct, and manage infrastructure. That's where you find most of these public-private partnerships, though you will find them occasionally in areas like healthcare and education. I don't, to be honest, differentiate so much between informal and formal partnerships as much as I think it's important to think about who the participants are in those partnerships and how those partnerships come together in a successful way. But there are some differences, right? An informal partnership really focuses on clearly aligning the incentives that each party involved in the partnership has. And generally that's driven by complementary resources that they bring to the table and abilities to make service delivery better. The informal ones have a varying degree of formality and agreement length. I've participated in informal partnerships that lasted, a matter of months around, say, a special event or something like that, and some that were put in place to actually make a permanent change to our service delivery model. All of these should be driven by the value for the residents, as all government service delivery should be, but that partnership should aim to provide better service and improve delivery, right? So this is really about something that one organization can't get done on their own and feels that they can do a better job of in partnership with someone else. And that ultimate goal is to deliver a public good in a better way. Better not always necessarily defined just as cheaper, which is a hallmark of public-private partnerships, right? Those are very much focused on risk sharing. That usually these are big projects that carry large price tags, hefty risk profiles, and by putting a public-private partnership in place, the participants can share in that risk and the rewards of the project. Public-private partnerships are often long-term contractual agreements. The longest one I've been involved in is an interesting public-private partnership around the operation of the country's largest underground parking garage. It is a 99-year agreement. And that makes you think about longevity in a really different way. Um, there is a strong focus on the value for money in these formal public-private partnerships, right? These are generally about getting better value for the public's money through innovation, technology, expertise. You don't often find these three Ps in areas where the bottom line is more complicated than just the ability to deliver for the strongest value for dollar. In these public-private partnerships, the formal ones, we're beginning to see more and more performance-based payments. So payments linked to performance metrics, to hitting milestones, to achieving a certain outcome around number of people served, around miles created, around the amount of revenue generated from a given piece of physical infrastructure. But they do share that public interest focus. So whether that agreement is informal or formal, that the goal here is always to be able to bring together the right team to do the best thing for an organization's constituents. So there's a number of values that come into play when you're forming a partnership, and it's important to keep these in mind as you're thinking about, how to structure a partnership, if a partnership is even necessary. And so you're seeing here a list of just 8 of those. There are, I'm sure, others, but they have to be, one of the things that's important about these 8 things is that the value of the partnership may be different for each of the members engaging in that partnership, but they have to be roughly the same scale, right? You can't have one organization joining the partnership that sort of feels that they're putting more in than they're getting out, and vice versa. So to take a quick look at those 8 different value propositions. So resource sharing is a relatively easy one, right? All of our organizations are strapped for both funding and non-monetary resources these days, and the ability to complement the resources available to solve a problem through a partnership is a strong driver. We talked before a bit about risk mitigation, and bringing a partner to the table can expand our ability to mitigate risk. And you actually see some of these partnerships emerging that are focused entirely on risk mitigation around the cybersecurity space. Expanded reach, right? This one comes into play a lot across different levels of government, where you may have services being delivered at, say, the city and county level, or the county and state level, and they're similar. There's similar services being provided to similar types of people, and by combining their work, you can reach the same set, or you can reach a bigger set of people with a better service offering by complementing each other and working together. The innovation and learning is a really interesting one, right? I know that there's a probably not in this call, right? There's a stereotypical view that governments are not innovative, that we don't necessarily learn from each other. I certainly don't believe that after my 20 years of working from this space, but we're not the source of all innovation. And by partnering with, say, a private sector organization, or a university, or even a nonprofit that has deep expertise in an area, we can lever up our ability to innovate around a given solution type. And you'll see some examples of that. It's, the goal here is to spread the aperture of what we know. Improved service delivery is, why most of us are here thinking about partnerships in the first place. The ability to get a better service to our constituents in a faster or cheaper way can be achieved through those partnerships in a way that you might not be able to do it with the resources that you have alone. Finally, efficiency, right? because of those strapped resources, right? Being able to deliver something with less required resources is part of what's critical. And then access to technology and expertise, right? We know that no organization has absolutely every kind of expertise or technology that it needs to solve every problem it feels in its purview. So establishing partnerships that gives you access to that technology and expertise, or even access to create purpose-built technology to the problem that you're trying to solve is a lever across partnerships. And then finally, enhanced credibility, right? Especially in this day and age where many of our constituents may not maintain the trust with city government in certain programmatic areas that perhaps we had even just 10 years ago. Partnering with an organization, perhaps a community-based nonprofit that is deeply ingrained in the community, can help enhance the credibility of the program and improve the outcomes by delivering through someone who does have that trust of the constituents. Sorry, guys, you have to go. No. Finally, okay, sorry about that, guys. It is summer and I have a number of little campers at home. I apologize. So let's talk a little bit about the different examples. And when I set out to sort of think this through, I decided to start sort of close in and then expand the breadth of that partnership definition. So the first kind of partnership that I have here, and there's an example of 6 as we go through them, is the interdepartmental partnership. This is kind of the easiest. Many of us are probably doing this without even thinking about it. And this is where, one organization within your department partners with another organization that may have a separate mandate, separate resources to bring a new program to the table to enhance service delivery. This one usually can be handled quite informally because both organizations fall under the same leadership. They also tend to be relatively easy to implement and not require all that much effort to maintain or track the results of. So an interesting example of one of these comes from a Midwestern state health department. And the department within the state health commission, there were 2 departments, right? One responsible for tracking flu rates and the rates of vaccination, the other responsible for tracking dental services to minors. Might sound like a bit of an odd combination, but what they were chasing or trying better to understand was what was driving absenteeism across the state's schools. And what they learned was that by bringing the data together around flu vaccination and flu rates with essentially toothaches, they actually could get a really strong perspective on what were the top 2 health reasons that students might miss school at the K through 12 level. They were able to use that understanding to actually change some of their policies. And at the end of the day, ended up doing what seems really simple, but some rather innovative things, like training dental hygienists to deliver flu vaccines through some of the state-funded health clinics, dental clinics in the state. They were able to reach more children with both the flu vaccine and with better preventative dental care by understanding the population better, and use that to decrease the rates of absenteeism across the state. So those are pretty easy ones. So the next one would be the interdepartmental. So this would be, 2 different government organizations at the same level of government, such as one state department to another. I differentiate these by the fact that the 2 partners in an interdepartmental partnership, it's a lot of partners, roll up to the same elected leader, right? So oftentimes these are driven by alignment with that leader's agenda. They generally don't require any contractual or legislative action, but they can be more formal in terms of the processes needed to do this because you're now working across agencies if you're thinking about this at the state level. So a really interesting example can be the deployment of green infrastructure at the state level. And this is actually a type of partnership that, given the work I've done in this space around green infrastructure, we're seeing probably in upwards of 20 to 30 states at this point, putting partnerships in place over the last 5 years. So the Department of Transportation, right, is responsible for planning, building, and maintaining infrastructure across the state. Um, and they do that very well, right? The Department of Environment is responsible for protecting, improving the state's natural environs. And they know that there are tools related to infrastructure development and management that can have a positive impact on challenges facing the state's environment. So by creating a partnership between those two departments, they're able to build and finance an infrastructure plan that can address challenges such as flooding, right? So instead of the Department of Transportation building a highway the way it always has, with materials it has always used, trying to manage runoff in the ways that it always has, by partnering with the Department of Environment, they can bring new green infrastructure elements into the design of that highway, from um, absorbing street tops to berms along the side of the highway that can actually be filled with sensors to collect water, et cetera. And in that way, manage the runoff flooding from highways in a more effective way, both for the performance of the roads, which is what the Department of Transportation cares about, and to the protection of the environment, which is what the Department of Environment cares about. Oftentimes within this structure, you'll actually see the two departments go out to bid together, looking for the contractual services that they need to execute on their partnership. Between government organizations. So the difference between the last page and this page is, in my mind, often a difference in executive leadership and possibly a difference in level of government. So an example of this would be a city to state partnership, a state to state partnership. I don't mention sort of state or city to federal partnerships here, only because in my experience, and if yours is different, I would love to hear it. I have not experienced many sort of bespoke or informally orchestrated federal partnerships that, basically that did not have to go through official federal contracting. These partnerships, though, at the state and city level are more formal than the internal ones that we've just talked about. They oftentimes require specific authority from the legislature or from a leader within the organization for execution, and they tend to have more formal reviews of their performance. They tend to be put in place for a specific amount of time to be evaluated in terms of their impact before they're extended beyond that window. And we'll talk a minute about that need to have a specific authority to put a partnership in place. So a good example here is a data partnership between a state and a city, where the state agrees to share vehicle registration data to support the city's public safety operations, right? There's a technical solution here where an interface is built to bring that data into the process flow where the city needs it, instead of having to have human resources make individual phone calls to confirm vehicle registration. In this specific example, both the city CIO and the state CIO had the authority within their roles to develop and sign this type of partnership agreement. And we're beginning to see that more and more in terms of how the priority of forming partnerships is sort of moving to the forefront. And so to facilitate establishing those partnerships, certain roles across the government, whether that's city or state or county, are given the authority to execute those partnerships. In the city of Chicago, which is the city government that I know best, there is limited partnership authority, both with the CIO, with the chief resilience officer, with the head of the law department, and also with the chief procurement officer. Those are all defined a little bit differently, but they're captured as formal responsibilities in the city code around those four roles. So those agreements don't have to actually go to the city council every time a new agreement is put in place. In the case of this example, because the city was actually getting most of the value from this partnership, the city shouldered the majority of the interface work and the cost of putting that interface in place to kind of offset the benefit that they were receiving from the state by sharing this data. All right. Partnering with private sector organizations. So this is probably where things get the most fun, because not only are you blending resources and approaches, but you're blending some very different incentives, um, some very different cultures, and trying to put a program in place that works. Partnerships with private sector organizations, in my experience, really hinge on if the incentives can be aligned between the two partners. These are often formally contracted partnerships that might result from an RFP or from some sort of legislative approval or other formal process. These can require, more extensive resources than the other types of partnerships we spoke about before. And they can require more resources to be maintained over time, simply because you are, in this case, kind of getting, um, you know, two big organizations, two complex organizations likely to work together. So, just setting up those resources might require input from your legal department, from your procurement department, from whichever departments programmatically are involved in the program that you're talking about. And the corporate partner, the private sector partner, will bring those same parties to the table. So there's common examples around this in the state and private sector and at the city level as well, around partnerships that focus on economic development. And I think many of us are familiar with this model, right? Where the state, for their side of the partnership, or the city provides tax incentives, perhaps some infrastructure improvements, and even job training in return to attract a corporate investment of a factory or some sort of production facility. And the state is interested in doing this because of the return from a job creation perspective, and the investment in specific expertise, right? The common example of this one is always the car plant, right? And so that's, yes, about the immediate jobs, but also about that state's commitment to maintaining a level of automotive expertise that it thinks is critical for its economic health and well-being in the future. There's less common examples of this in other areas where the government and the private sector come together, to execute a specific government service, right? And oftentimes the private sector partner is bringing to the table some advanced methods or technology that the government may not be able to develop itself or have the funds to access directly through a contract. And so they'll put in place a risk and reward contract, which you'll see leveraged in areas like debt collection, where the private sector organization is actually paid in that partnership a portion of the funds that are raised, and they're taking the risk that they may not actually hit that number. There's other examples as well, and we can talk about some of those as we go on. But this is an area that is expanding, I think, quite quickly as governments are asked by their residents to provide more and different kinds of services, and the private sector has resources and expertise that the government needs to actually deliver those services. And the traditional model of writing an RFP and the company throwing a response over the wall, while that's very good in commoditized areas like buying a CRM system or contracting for subsidized childcare, that RFP process does not allow for the innovation of new service delivery models that can be achieved by the private sector and the government sector actually working together outside of those bonds of a traditional contract. All right, working with nonprofits. This is a very common model. Many of us have probably seen it. These also are becoming more complex, I think, as the problems that government is taking on are becoming more complex. So oftentimes the government will partner with a nonprofit organization to extend their reach to specific populations that have specific needs. This can be contracted through an RFP. For folks on the phone that have like health and human service experience, this is the model in a lot of places for delivering health and human services, where the government is funding those services, but the actual delivery is done by a nonprofit organization in the community. But a different interesting example is that gave greater breadth to the reach of the state through the partnership is, sorry for the typo, is a partnership from a state in the Northeast where the state was looking to innovate around their homeless services and provide a better suite of those services to bring down their homeless numbers. So the state sets policy and regulation around homeless services and provides funding for both emergency shelters and long-term housing, right? Those shelters are managed by the nonprofit. That part is a relatively traditional relationship. What is interesting about this one is then working together, both the state and the nonprofit provided coordinated wraparound services to address those ancillary problems that are oftentimes at the root of homelessness, like mental health needs, job training, etc. By creating this larger portfolio of supportive services, that model has produced improved long-term results. So the government is getting both more efficient delivery of of traditional homeless services, such as the emergency shelter, and also expanding the breadth of services available to move people into long-term sustainable housing situations. So working with the community, and this one is my favorite. I want to differentiate between working with the community and working through a nonprofit to reach the community. Um, you're seeing more and more opportunities to work directly with, or you're seeing more and more examples of government working directly with their constituents as governments transition to a more citizen-centric delivery model in many ways. This is hard, right? When I think about the work we did in Chicago, right? Our community was just shy of 3 million people. And how do you actually work with a group of that size, or how do you find the members of that group that are the right ones to engage in the process that you have? There's a number of methodologies out there for how you engage the community. Um, and the complications here are often, right, how you define the group of who you're trying to reach, how you engage them so that they feel compelled to engage back, and how the responsibilities are shared across that partnership to both sides, right? There's usually no sort of necessarily like contractual documentation in partners like this, so they require an investment of time and interest to bring parties to the table. Um, but they can produce measurable results. So I am going to use an example from Chicago on this one, and the partnerships that the city was able to build with its civic tech community. So to get to this point, a number of city officials invested in building this relationship through attendance at meetups where they knew they would find civic tech members, by adopting suggestions that were discussed in those meetups so that the potential like volunteers and community members knew that they were being heard and that their input was being valued. The city adopted a number of policies and provided a number of services that they knew would support this relationship between the city and the civic tech community, right? This is where a lot of the push, say 10 years ago, for open data came from. That the more data the city published, the more the civic tech community would be able to engage with city services, with addressing city challenges. In return, and this was not a fast process, but in return, those civic tech volunteers invested in building applications to address city challenges. Some of those applications were adopted actually directly into the city's operational portfolio, where the city actually took on the code developed by the volunteers. Some of them were not adopted, but it provides a really interesting perspective that those citizen volunteers are not bound by some of the same sort of drivers that the city is. And so they can be incentivized to develop applications that can help residents that the city would not be able to develop. And so the best example that I can give you of that is around sort of the challenge of ticketing for street cleaning, right? We've all been there. The signs go up, somebody doesn't see one, you're parked where you're not supposed to be when the street cleaner comes along and you get a ticket. It is not, to be honest, in the city's best interest to make that process necessarily any easier because it is a source of revenue. However, we can publish and did publish the data around the annual schedule of street cleaning for the entire city. And a group of volunteers was able to use that data to build a publicly available app that you could sign up to as a resident that would alert you to the fact that the street cleaner was coming sometime in the next 24 hours, et cetera, to where you were parked. This did have an impact on the city's revenue stream from tickets related to street cleaning. But at the same time, and this one is hard to measure, but I would hazard a guess that we had a fairly large number of residents who were much happier engaging with this app and getting an alert to move than they would have been paying that parking ticket. And at the end of the day, that is also something that the city cares about, right? The health and well-being and sort of customer satisfaction of its constituents. So working with the community is very, very challenging, but it can expand the resources available to the government and the perspective that the government has around service delivery in ways that other partnerships may not necessarily have as an impact. And then the last example, right, with multiple parties. And I think that this approach is becoming more and more common. I think if you look through your own government experience, you'll realize that there's a number of challenges facing governments at every level that cannot be solved by one or even two organizations alone. That the responsibility for the problem, that the expertise around the problem, and the incentives to execute on a solution are spread across a number of organizations. And if you can just find a way to bring those together, you can bring a viable solution to the table. So multi-party partnerships, right? Very complicated, very resource intensive. There's a saying that my grandmother always used to say that if you want to go somewhere fast, go by yourself. If you want to go far, take your team, take your family. I think that holds true to collaborations and partnerships, that if you need to move with speed, the less parties and the less decision makers in the room, the better. But if you want to go further, if you want to have stronger impact, then the more parties you have, the better. And the time you invest in bringing a multi-party partnership together produces dividends, not just for the initial project that you established the organization for, but it makes it easier the next time because you've built that path to partnership that you can follow the next time you need to do that. So multi-party partnerships. So they can provide access to all kinds of expertise and innovation. The organizations I've seen in partnerships kind of is a never-ending list that you might capture by government organizations, private sector organizations, big and small, NGOs, academia, advocacy groups. So there's no limit. I've never seen, an example of, well, that type of organization doesn't fit in a multi-party collaboration with government. The trick again here is aligning the incentives that everyone has to solve the problem and to contribute resources to that problem. These are generally supported by a purpose-built agreement, and I don't know where my sentence went, by a purpose-built agreement because these tend to be unique one-offs, and oftentimes they have to be approved by the legislature. So let's go through one example, right? This one I'm naming just because I find it to be such an interesting example, and there aren't as many of these out there. And that's the example of the California Climate Action Partnership, which some of you might be familiar with. So this is a partnership that the state of California put together that has academic, nonprofit, advocacy, and private sector organizations as part of it. And they're all playing a slightly different role, right? The state is responsible for setting policies and regulations to support the climate action strategy for the state of California. Academia is responsible for researching new methods and technologies, and also for evaluating results so that the partnership knows that it's hitting the goals that it set for itself. Right? Corporations are working with academia, but leveraging some of that R&D, some of their own R&D to develop new solutions to the climate challenge, and also to implement measures internally within their own company so that they can play their own role that they need to in terms of their impact on climate change. And then the NGOs are providing interesting services around outreach and collaboration, around advocacy to build support. So at the end of the day, you have this community of partners all focused on the same strategy of achieving California's climate action plan, and all of them bringing to the table the resources that they can share that none of the other partners can. What's most interesting and sometimes challenging around multi-party partnerships is who's responsible for actually establishing the partnership. Sometimes you have organizations like your economic development entity, whether that's a commission or an agency, who will bring together multiple partners to execute on something within their scope. A good example actually of this would have been, I think many of us remember, that sort of race around Amazon second headquarters, right? The number of partners that had to come together in those cities, including the states in those cities that were targeted on the short list, was extensive. All in service to trying to gain the jobs and financial investment that having an Amazon headquarters would lead to. We are seeing certain examples, though, where a government is investing in creating an organization who is responsible for driving these kinds of multi-party collaborations. A good example is an organization being built in Detroit that's focused primarily right now on transportation and mobility challenges. But the defining purpose of the organization in Detroit is to bring together multi-party agreements, multi-party partnerships to address challenges like increasing access to their downtown, to drive down the air quality challenges they have from emissions. And that organization, while involved in each one of those projects, is also there to make sure that the multi-party partnership is in place for each one of those projects. We had a similar organization in Chicago that started with the desire that the mayor had to extend the city's ability to innovate around challenging problems like flooding, like mobility challenges from traffic to the adoption of driverless cars, to challenges like in the health and human services space, how to provide identity services to people who are homeless. That organization actually expanded over time and involved more than 100 different partners assigned to different projects, not all within the same project. And within that partnership included 34 different cities as well. So the role of that organization was both to define the strategy and priority of projects that the partners were willing to invest in, and then create both the contractual and service delivery vehicles needed to bring those parties together to actually execute on a specific project. So this is how I see the different types of partnerships that governments should be thinking about and often are thinking about, starting from the simple ones within an agency and moving all the way to multiple parties, including potentially your community or your voters involved in that partnership. And then, so my last thing was just to share with you some of the critical success factors I've seen from my experience putting together public-private partnerships, some of which have worked and some of which haven't. Some of these we've talked about. I can't stress this enough, right? Aligning incentives and leadership is critical, right? If someone is not on board with trying to solve the problem that you think is important, and if they don't see value for themselves in solving that problem, they shouldn't be a member of that partnership. Being generous with timelines, but including near-term milestones. It is hard to get 4 organizations, 5 organizations. My largest group was 12 organizations, all moving in the same direction, right? Getting a contract in place to hold that partnership together. Getting agreement around the end goal for what the project is going to achieve. And so being patient with how long that takes, while at the same time driving to interim milestones, is critical to moving these things along. This is also where you'll find the most concern from our private sector partners, right? My favorite complaint was, well, it's just going to take the city in one case, the state in another. It's going to take them so long to contract this. The government organization I was working with was never the last one done with their review and development and even signing of the contract. That was always a large public sector company. Large private sector company. So the idea that we move as government workers, that we move more slowly than the private sector is simply just not true. The costs and benefits of the partnership need to be clear. They may be different for each partner, but they have to be similar in scale. And the other thing that makes multi-partner partnerships so challenging is that benefit of cost, or that balance of cost benefit across the partners. Because when you're talking with a potential partner, not only do you need to strike that balance of incentive and benefit with that partner, you need to ensure that that balance is struck between them and the other members of the consortium as well. We talked about this, but the more members in the partnership, the more complex it is to establish it and manage it over time. But I have always found that that there is more value when you bring multiple partners together to deliver on a challenge that you're trying to address. I am sure that there are diminishing returns on this somewhere. I don't have any great wisdom on where that point is. I will tell you that project I mentioned that had 12 partners was really hard to manage. Whereas projects we did that had between 5 and 7 partners were actually, once you had laid all the groundwork, once all the incentives were aligned, once the project plan was in place, those were relatively easy to execute on. Governance models and contracting approaches matter, and you should define them early, right? If the end goal of a given project is going to result in revenue for one of the parties, right? Clearly identifying the source and the share of that revenue early is critical, because it's very easy in a complex project to get, say, halfway through and realize that you have 2 partners thinking they both were going to get the lion's share of some part of the solution. And so it's much better to define that up front. And then finally, to move beyond the impact of personality to create institutional partnerships. We all have been familiar with like electoral cycles and having projects that go away or important partnerships that go away when leadership changes. 2 suggestions on moving beyond this. One is establishing an organization that's responsible for multi-party partnerships, that can keep the focus and the priority on bringing those partnerships together, kind of regardless of who's in the leadership position at that point, and shift those partnerships to align with the priorities of that leader. And then second, the more process work that you can institutionalize either in templates or in legislation if necessary, all adds towards maintaining the sort of life cycle of potential partnerships that you need to expand beyond the given election cycle. And this is just my information. If anybody's ever trying to reach me, I'm always happy to help. I find these partnerships fascinating. They have been an aspect of my work in both sort of private sector work when I was a consultant at IBM, and in almost all of the work that I did working within government. So happy to help or chat with anyone as they're working through some of the same issues. And with that, I think we have about 15 minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, Brenna. Let me just take us off record.